Today I'm building the arms for my Hydra Stomper Iron Man suit from Marvel's What If. For this build, I used craft foam, floor mat foam, half cylinder foam, coffee foam, putty, super glue, hot glue, contact cement, gray plastidip, cardboard tubes of varying diameter, green spray paint, sharpening stone, scrap PVC pipe, a PVC cutter, sanding tools, safety gear, scissors, razor pens, and a box cutter. First I figured out the shape of the forearm by modifying one of my old templates. Then I transferred it to cardboard for stability. It's kind of hard to trace a foil tape template. And finally, transferred it to foam floor mats, taking care to include the registration marks, those little triangles. Those will be instrumental in helping me line up the edges. I weighted the floor mats down with machinist blocks so the foam doesn't slide around while I'm working. I cut those out with a work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I'm also being careful to make sure that my blade is angled perfectly straight up and down. This will prevent any ridges or depressions from forming in the foam after I join the two sides. I was, however, able to get away with using scissors for some of the cuts. To make sure the edges were as smooth as possible, I sanded them on my belt sander. It's still crazy hot in here. Oh, although I should mention, you shouldn't be wearing long sleeves while using the belt sander, or any rotary tool. I knew that about saws, because the blade could snag your sleeve, but that is also a risk while you're sanding, so polo shirts. You know, if your shop isn't a million degrees. A smooth edge will give you better adhesion. I repeated the process for the larger piece, weighting the template down as well so as not to mess up my trace. This will be the outer facing portion of the forearm. Those darts, or sort of curved pie slices at the top, are there to help give it a curved shape. This knife blade is starting to dull out, so I snapped the end off in order to start fresh. You want to wear eye protection when doing this, and be careful about how you dispose of razor blades. See, now I can cut that out a lot easier and avoid a great deal of sanding. Next, I heat formed the pieces using my heat gun. When it was sufficiently heated up, I pressed it over half of a giant novelty Easter egg that I'm using as a planishing iron, or anvil, to help shape the foam into a curved piece. I did the same with the interior part of the forearm, and then set the pieces inside of the Easter egg half to cool. This will help them retain their curved shape. Next, I contact cemented them together. The gauntlets of the Hydra Stomper have these riveted sections along the top, so I made those by cutting up strips of foam 2 inches tall and about a foot long. Well, you can count the squares. And then I cut the puzzle pieces off of the side strips of the foam floor mats to make the rivet strips more three-dimensional looking. For the rivets themselves, I'm going to use these rivets that I've accumulated over the years while making kyber crystals. That sentence makes 0 sense. Yeah, I should explain that. I have a few random detail greebly molds that I use as overflow molds in case I miscalculate the resin volume when I'm casting kyber crystals, and a few of them are rivets. I mean, I tend to overcalculate the volume anyway, just so I don't end up with half a kyber crystal. So every time I make a batch of kyber crystals, I also end up with a rivet or two. And over the years, it's added up, so much so they get their own container on my materials wall. When I had figured out the spacing, I marked off where the rivets would go on each panel, then I drilled them out using a sharpened metal pen casing, and then I popped the rivets in there one by one. They actually stick in there just as a tension fit because the stalk of the rivet is slightly wider than the pen casing, but in order to keep them from backing out over time from repeated motion, I hot glued them on the inside. This provides just a little bit of stability. Then I glued the walls on with hot glue. This isn't as strong as contact cement, but it's fine here because these pieces are cosmetic and they're going to have very little stress on them. Then I covered up the seams with Alex Fast Dry Putty. It's a DAP product. Now it makes sense for all mech suits to have machine panels, so if you can get your seams to line up with those machine panels, you can avoid a lot of puttying. But I think the implication here is that the armor on the gauntlets are massive plates that are bolted together. So I have to erase some of these seams to imply that it's all one plate. When the putty dried, I smoothed it out even more on the belt sander. You want to be really gentle with this step, like don't press it onto the belt, at least not with more weight than the prop itself. Otherwise, the putty could rip right out. Next, I attached the rivet strips to the top of the forearm using hot glue and a little bit of super glue to reinforce the end. Then I put more putty along the new seams because that area should be really more of a slope rather than a right angle. Then I began working on the elbow joint. I'm making that out of an oatmeal container. Not a sponsor. Yet? Eh? Quaker Oats? Just saying. I cut a container in half and then cut out essentially 270 degrees, so 3/4 of the circumference, in order to make room for my arm both at the outstretched and bent positions. Then I traced and cut a foam circle to fill in one or both of the ends. I hot glued that in place and then cut slightly smaller diameter circles to go on top of it. This will need to be stacked at least 2 sheets thick. These circles happen to be already painted and weathered because they're from another prop that did not survive my last move. Hashtag maker problems. I weighted that down with a metal machinist block, but any weight will do, really.
So once those raised parts are made, you can wrap them in the puzzle piece strips with the puzzles cut off, but those are going to want to lie flat. So you'll need to use something that has a curve in it. I'm using this. It was the edge of a circle that I cut out, I think for the TIE Fighter build.
I hot glued that circle detail into the cylinder. It was about twice as long as it needed to be, which is fortunate because I need to do the same thing on the other side. So I cut off the excess, secured the end, and then repeated the process. And this is what it should look like. I took the worst looking of the two sides and added these curved support struts. They're hot glued on, but to help strengthen them, I pressed toothpicks into the foam. Anywhere you do this, you want to be careful that you're not going to stab yourself. I figured out where they were going to lie on the inside of the forearm and sanded away the diamond pattern with my rotary tool so that the glue would adhere better. Then I contact cemented the finished elbow joint cylinder into the arm. Next, I had to make the elbow bone, I guess the funny bone. Does that have a medical term? I'm sure it does. For that, I cut this foam chevron and used an entirely too dull razor pen to cut the trenches in the back that, when folded together, create a three-dimensional shape with no visible seam. I cut a strip of foam to fill in that empty space and glued them all together. I sanded a curve in the end where it would contact the joint, and then I hot glued it in place. I weighted it down with metal machinist blocks, which will not only help it hold in place, but as the glue dries, well, sets up, cools. There we go. The blocks, being metal, will help to disperse the heat. When it was secure, I glued the joint as well. Now, as I'm going through my reference images, I'm noticing that the inner side of the forearm is also supposed to meet up with that joint cylinder. Hinge? Sure. So I made another curved piece of foam to extend the armor, which means more gluing and sanding. But that's what I signed up for, so let's get to it. While I waited for that to set up, I moved on to the shoulder pauldron. Shoulder pauldron? Pauldron. Armor. I moved on to the shoulder pauldron. I made it using the front part on my xenomorph templates. They're oddly similar to Hydra Stomper shoulders. In fact, you could arguably cut the middle out of the xenomorph dome and use it for both arm parts. Hindsight's 2020. So I traced, cut, and heat formed those into a curved shape. Then I contact cemented those together. When the glue was done drying, I cut off the excess, and then added a strip of armor to match the source material.
Alright, so now this is supposed to be the top pauldron, and there's an even larger pauldron beneath this that sticks out along the edges. And you can do that, but it's kind of a waste of foam. In my opinion, it would be easier to just cut strips that only go from like here to here and glue them in. So I think that's what I'm gonna do.
Then I began work on the internal armor. This is 5 inches by 20 inches. In order to create one of the grooves, I made an incision about 1/8 of an inch deep and 1/4 of an inch from the frame. Then I heat formed the sheet to make it curved, but also to open up that incision. Then I glued it into the pauldron and clamped it down while the glue cooled. I have a foam spacer between the clamp and the pauldron in order to prevent the clamp from leaving an impression on the outside. I don't really care about the inside. Then I refined the edge and cleaned it up with my rotary tool because this blade's starting to dull out. Should probably change it as well.
Okay, so I'm actually using the offcut as the interior, partially because it's already formed into a curve, but also to save on foam, and to not feel like I wasted the work that I did on those seams.
I glued that in there and then refined the edges with scissors. Sometimes you don't need to sand. Then I puttied the seams. The upper arm is just a tube, so feel free to use a cardboard tube if you have one, but alas, I have exhausted my supply of oatmeal containers. So, guess I'll be using foam. I cut a giant foam rectangle. It's actually 20 inches, almost the length of a foam floor tile. Heat formed it, rolled it up, and stuck it into a cylinder, transparent for your benefit, or maybe because it happened to be within arm's reach. A lot of my material choices are based on laziness. When it cooled, I glued the edges together. Then I built this structure on top of the seam. It's cosmetic, but also reinforces the seam. Then I puttied the visible seams. Those will need to dry before I can adapt them, so for now, I'll move on to the hand. I made the hand out of scrap foam, the palm. I'm alternating between various thicknesses such as 4mm and 2mm craft foam, in addition to the floor mats.
Totally not a repurposed Gundam hand because Odin beat me to the punch. What? Odin! Nice, alright.
And then I used engine wire conduit, left over from the alien build, for the fingers. The 2mm craft foam was primarily used for the knuckles and fingertips. And now it's time for the big guns. I mean, blasters. Blasters. Big old blasters. These sci-fis. Lasers, simulated violence. All those pilots had parachutes. No one was in those tanks that got crushed. Phew. That was close. And then I made the blasters out of cardboard with foam spacers. So my initial gut instinct is to make them out of PVC, just because I've gotten into that habit from all the lightsabers and previous blasters. But PVC is surprisingly heavy. Like that Vision Saber I just built, I assumed that was going to be really light, but it's about as heavy as my Graflex, which is steel. So you really don't want to be wearing a suit of armor that's essentially made of insulation and have a heavy weight on your arm. So I can't really do anything about the insulation, but I can cut back on the weight. So hence cardboard. When they were done, I embedded those into the forearm. So I would love to say that it's ready for paint at this point, but there are a few more details that I need to make before I start painting. I made the smaller rivets by pressing a pen casing into the foam the same way that I made the holes for the larger rivets, but just not going all the way through. Similarly, I used a sharpened metal pipe for the larger ones. You can also make rivets by pressing your rotary tool drum bit into the foam, but that has a high likelihood of jumping out and creating a scar across your armor. So I try to avoid that if I can, which is usually. Then for the indents and trenches, I cut those out with the work knife, which I continually sharpened in order to keep the cut clean and uniform. I also used strips of EVA foam half cylinders, bevels, to make some of the other details. Bevels. Then I painted the pieces individually with gray Plastidip. You want to do this while your prop is still in pieces, otherwise the joints will glue together from the paint. When they dried, I painted them green to match the helmet. I'm gonna wait to do the weathering because this paint really should have a week to fully dry before adding any additional coats. It was, however, dry enough to assemble, so I connected the pieces using foam strips and backpack straps. Now to make the left arm, simply aim your screen at a mirror and replay this video from the beginning while watching the reflection. Although the left arm does have a treaded armor panel instead of blasters. You know, for panzer smashing. And there you go. That's how I built a Hydra Stomper arm from Marvel's What If. Be sure to subscribe to see the rest of the build videos. If you're somehow seeing this before the helmet build, then you can check that out right here, and the next one will be right below it. This video is brought to you by my patrons, who are scrolling by right now. Want to shout out Jazzman and Lucas, who came on board from the first Hydra Stomper video and helped speed up this one. And if you'd like to join them, it would go a long way towards finishing the whole Hydra Stomper suit. Because believe me, the torso is going to be way more complicated than the arms. And I do not want to spend a year working on one project. Not to mention, patrons get the videos ad-free and early. So thanks for supporting me, thanks for watching, happy crafting, and see you later.